Hey there! Thank you so much for joining me on my channel today. My name is Samantha and I am the knitter, knitwear designer, PhD student, vlogger, all those fun things behind the account The Stricka Chick. We're starting a new series of videos today. I write these posts on my blog on my website, I'll link that below, about yarn reviews. I love yarn, I love playing with yarn, I love trying new kinds of yarn. And I usually, what I do when I write them up is I talk you guys through what the yarn is, obviously, what it's composed of, what it's good for, what it's not so good for, and the projects that I've knit in it and what I recommend for it. And I think that's just kind of such a fun thing to do for myself as well as putting it out there, is just to kind of look at different kinds of yarn and just reflect a little on how it wears and how it behaves, just so I can remember what it's good for in the future. So I figured, because it's such a tactile thing, right? Touching yarn and playing with yarn. I'm gonna do some video yarn reviews. So I'll talk to you guys a little bit about different yarns that are available to us here in Norway. I live in the Arctic Circle of Norway, so all of my local yarn stores carry some generic European yarn as well as some very special typical Norwegian yarn. Today we are starting off with a fairly generic European yarn, Drops Eyre. So you guys, I mean, obviously, I don't know if you've watched my videos before. If you're returning, welcome. Thanks for joining again. If you're new, I talk a lot about Drops Eyre on this channel. It is one of my favorite yarns to work with. It is just so squishy and nice. I'm gonna try to let that focus. So Drops Eyre, the company Drops I think they're based in Norway, but they're huge, and they have retailers all over the world. They're obviously easiest to get their hands on if you live in Europe, but I know that people in the States are able to get it through different companies. I don't know what shipping is like, but it's a really nice, very affordable yarn brand to work with. Drops Eyre is a alpaca wool blend. It's 65% alpaca, 28% polyamide, and 7% wool. And what you get with this is a yarn that can be used on, I think Drops recommends 4.5 to 5.5 millimeter needles, but then on the yarn label they have 5 millimeter needles. And it's a blow yarn, which means that, let me try to show you with the fiber, if you've never worked with Drops Eyre. So basically what it means is that the fibers are kind of blown out a little bit, like this. So it's a very airy yarn. It's not kind of, if you've worked with a traditional merino wool, you know that it's kind of, it's very solid, very stable. Drops Eyre isn't like that. It's a fuzzy kind of, very breathable yarn. And the polyamide, I think, comes in because they have like a chain in the yarn, and then they have the alpaca and the wool fibers that are kind of blown around it. And because of that, you get some improved stability because of the synthetic fiber that's in there, but it's also a really nice and warm yarn, and I think that is because of the alpaca fiber, because it is mostly an alpaca yarn. As far as the length goes, so these are sold in 50-gram hanks, or these little donuts, and you get 150 meters in every 50-gram donut, which I think is a great little deal. I'm going to alternate. This is the colorway 14, which I have been saving in my stash for a long time, and I recently bought this color that actually prompted this yarn review. This is their shade 37. It's one of their new colors. Look at that blue. Yeah, so they market it as a medium thick blow yarn made of baby alpaca and merino wool, and it is a very affordable yarn, like I mentioned before. In Norway they sell it, I think the normal price for it is 62 Norwegian kroner per thing, donut, skein, hank, whatever you prefer to call it, of yarn. But they usually do sales. It's very, very common to find Drops yarns in general on sale. They have a really big alpaca sale once every year that lasts for at least a month, if not 2. And I had a big yarn haul around that time. That's when I bought this as well. And I'll link to that in this or this above, so you can watch that video if you want to see a larger variety of drops yarns, because today we'll be focusing on Eyre. So when they do that, they usually discount the yarn to 40%, and then you can get, I mean, that's essentially like paying $3 or $4 for 150 meters of yarn, which is not bad at all. And I have used Drops Eyre for a lot of different projects. I just want to show you some colorways that I have in my stash right now. They have an extensive colorway option list that you can choose from. They have some very, very nice neutrals. They have recently been getting more into bright colors, which I love. I think they also have a parrot green, like a very bright Kelly green Drops Eyre that I would work with. But I also just knit up my strand sweater, which is a really bright green sweater, so I feel like I've kind of gotten that out of my system. So I am really excited to cast on this color and work with it. But some other really nice neutral colors that I have in my stash are this shade of Drops Eyre, which is just this really lovely variegated lilac-y. It almost like, it looks like a princessy unicorn type blend. It is very, I mean, it's purple with some blue and pink and white undertones here and there. It's shade 15. They did, as a heads up, Drops changed their manufacturing processes, I believe, of a variety of different yarns sometime last year, because this is an older yarn, or an older batch of Drops Eyre that I've had in my stash, and it says made in Peru. And then this yarn, which is one of their newer colors that I bought, it says made in the EU. So something happened. There is some kind of difference in the old Drops Eyre and the new Drops Eyre, but I haven't really noticed it as I've been knitting it up, because I knit my Tuscan sweater, which is knit in Drops Eyre and a strand of their kid silk, with this Drops Eyre, which is the new one that's made in the EU in the shade Clay, color 35. And it felt the same to me as the old Drops Eyre. It didn't feel so bad. Versus a yarn like Drop Sky, which I've mentioned before has completely changed what it feels like. The old Drop Sky feels a lot different just in terms of the tactile properties of the yarn than the new one. But Eyre is pretty solid, and I just want to show you all the colors I have in my stash right now. So this is color 30, which is a really nice sage green. We'll prop that up here. And this colorway again. So this is what I have in my stash for Drops Eyre. Yes, lots to work with, as you can see. So Drops Eyre is good for a lot of very versatile projects, as I will show you in my handy dandy little box next to me. I don't know if you can see it or if it's off screen, but if you can see it there. But I want to start off with something that it's not so good for, but I've worked around it anyway. So I've mentioned in my yarn review of Drops Eyre that Drops Eyre is good for a lot of things, but not necessarily structural knitting. So if you followed the strikter strik trend that's been in Scandinavia, it's basically this method of knitting sweaters where you use knit and purl stitches, cross stitches. The Ingrid sweater by Petite Knit is a strikter strik, or the Bolgegenser by Sandnes Garn. I think those are what really kicked off the strikter strik trend, and now Line Halme Samse, who is a very famous Danish knitwear designer, she now has a strikter strik sweater as well. And I designed one last year at the beginning of the year. I think it's about a year ago, exactly a year ago now, that I was seeking testers for it. So it's a year old. This is the Liscannor sweater, if I can unfurl it and show you. And this is knit in Drops Eyre. So I mentioned that Drops Eyre is not so good for structural knitting. And the caveat to that being, when I was knitting the Liscannor sweater, I wanted to find panels of structures that actually showed up really well in Drops Eyre, because that to me was a challenge. If you can get these panels of knit and purl stitches to show up well in a fuzzy blow yarn, then that means if you knit them with a more solid yarn like Drops Big Merino, then they have to show up really well, even better. So that was my starting point, was like, I want them to show up in this yarn that's maybe not the go-to recommended choice for structural knitting. And I think it actually works very well in the Liscannor sweater, which is why I do recommend Drops Eyre for this sweater, because I think that the panels pop really well. I think they're a little bit subdued by the airiness of the yarn, but that's okay, because they still show up and it still looks like an interesting textured sweater. And I would recommend, I mean, I don't know if the gauge meets, but I think for something like my favorite things knitwear, sweater number 18 is another example of very popular strikk at the moment. And I think if you were to knit that in a blow yarn, I think that would show up really well too, because that's a fairly simple knit and purl design that would just look a little bit more kind of toned down with a blow yarn like Drops Eyre. So that's my little asterisk on saying that Drops Eyre is not good for structural knitting, because it can be good for some structural knitting, just not like very intricate stuff. Like, for example, I tried out this I tried out this panel for the Liscannor sweater where you had these diagonal rib kind of stitches, and you created that by just like kind of staggering where you put your knits and purl so that your rib was just diagonal instead of this way, and that did not work. That barely showed up. So I would definitely recommend swatching whatever strikk that you want to make in Drops Eyre before you actually make it, and then blocking that swatch, because whatever you think that the texture shows up like in Drops Eyre, I guarantee you it'll be toned down when you wash the sweater. So definitely make sure that you swatch and block before you commit to using Drops Eyre for a strikk sweater. But when it works, the results are really, really nice. Liscannor is still one of my favorite sweaters to wear, so I wouldn't say don't do it. I would just say proceed with caution, if that makes sense. And then another thing I say that I don't recommend Drops Eyre for is like really hard-wearing outdoor sweaters. And this, of course, might be more of a like Norwegian Scandinavian problem than like an issue that any of you guys might have if you are not from this part of the world. So here we have this concept of turgensers, or outdoor sweaters. So when we go hiking, we usually have like a special designated hiking sweater that we take up into the mountains with us, and we wear it when it gets a little chilly up there. We wear it around campfires. We wear it skiing. It's supposed to be a very hard-wearing sweater, and just because Drops Eyre is such a kind of breathable, fluffy yarn that doesn't really hold up to the elements of nature, I do not recommend it as a turgenser. So if you're looking for something that can be a little bit more like beat up and hardy, I would go for something like Drops Nepal, or the very traditional Eastex Lettlöpi, which I will do a yarn review on that too, because I love that yarn and I feel like it's such a nice, unique yarn. But yeah, I would definitely recommend something with just more, I don't know, just more of a like hard-wearing yarn. And of course, sometimes you might not realize that until you've knit with it yourself, but I can tell you from experience, Drops Eyre is not as hard-wearing of a yarn, and you would not want that for something that you're going to be like sweating in and, you know, like just outdoors for a long period of time and doing athletic stuff in. No, not in Drops Eyre. But I have knit a sweater that I use sometimes when I go like really light skiing on Tromsøya, the island where I live. We have a ski trail that runs around the island, and it's pretty like leisurely. It's not like going into the mountains or anything. I use my Drops Eyre sweater. That is the puppy dog sweater by Hollie Soave, because I just think this is super duper comfy and really, really soft. This is one of the sweaters that I recommend that you knit with Drops Eyre on my yarn review blog post of Drops Eyre, because it's so nice. First of all, I think that Drops Eyre has such a good selection of colors that you really do get the option to like kind of, I made these little husky faces, and it wouldn't have been possible with a yarn that didn't have so many different color options, I think. So Drops Eyre is great for that, where you can always find the color that you need, or the color that your project needs more like. But the other reason why I would recommend Drops Eyre for this is because it's such a heavy colorwork sweater. So if you look at all the colors that have gone into here, like yes, some of it is duplicate stitch, but there's also quite a bit of fair eyeling in here. And I think with a heavier yarn, like something that was more, like Drops Nepal, for example, something that was more kind of dense, that would just really weigh you down. And I think the sweater would also grow quite a bit when you're blocking it. So that's definitely another concern, and that's a reason why I like Drops Eyre so much, because the weight of the sweater doesn't pull the whole thing down because it's such a lightweight yarn. And that's why I would recommend it for a sweater with a lot of colors like this. Another nice thing about Drops Eyre that isn't necessarily true for all Drops yarns is that it's not a very splitty, like there's some yarns that when you try to seam with them or like do any kind of stitching, the yarn just breaks. I've noticed this particularly in tweed yarns. They tend to be a little more like if you pull any, like if you apply any tension like this, the yarn just snaps right off. Drop Soft tweed is one of those yarns. Rowan felted tweed does that too, but Drops Eyre actually does not. You have to really yank in order to break a strand of Drops Eyre when you're just trying to do some stitches with it. So I think it was really nice for this duplicate stitch technique. And this Drops Eyre held double too, so it's like a really dense sweater. I say dense, I don't mean dense in the way that it's heavy, I mean like it required a lot of yarn, but because the yarn itself is so lightweight, it's not a very heavy sweater at all. It feels really, really nice to wear, and it's really warm without feeling like overbearing. So I do recommend Drops Eyre for projects where you might, like things that recommend things like We Are Knitters Petite Wool. If you're looking for an alternative to that, then I would definitely recommend Drops Eyre. I think it is a lighter weight yarn it just feels nicer to have on you. So that's one of the pros of Drops Eyre, is that the lightweight lends itself to good thick sweaters without feeling extra chunky, and that's also the case here. So I mentioned that Drops Eyre is a good yarn choice for cables. Cables because, again, cables will really drag a fabric down, and when you knit in Drops Eyre, so this is my Eyre pullover. It's not spelled like Eyre, it's E-Y-R-E, named after Eyre Square in Galway, Ireland. This is a very cable-intensive sweater. And it is knit double-stranded on 9mm needles, so in a thicker yarn this could have really weighed down, but because it's Drops Eyre, it's still very lightweight and it feels nice to have on. So that's why I recommend Drops Eyre for cables. I also think that cables show up really nicely in Drops Eyre. You be the judge of that, but I think they show up really nicely. And I also think that yeah, they make for a comfier sweater. I don't mind having Drops Eyre right on my skin, which I'm actually wearing it now. This is right up against my skin. I don't have anything like a wool undershirt like I usually wear when I go outside, because I'm sitting in my home and that would be way too warm. So I think it's really, really nice to have right up against your skin. But as a disclaimer, I don't have any wool sensitivities, so that could be different for you depending on what your wool preference is like. What you can use Drops Eyre for. So there are quite a few. If you look at Norwegian knitwear designers, especially ones that are a little bit more small designers, like Adunestrik on Instagram, she a lot of her sweater options will suggest Drops Eyre as an alternative to whatever yarn she uses. One of the first sweaters that I ever knit actually was this, the Kristianes Bolgegenser by Annet Oppheim, who is a Danish designer. And she recommended 2 strands of Drops Eyre for this very pretty, very elegant lace knit sweater, which is actually inspired by a Gani sweater. Gani is a Danish design company, for those of you who don't know. So it's inspired by one of their sweaters that I think they had a price tag of like $500 on it, and so she made a pattern and she was like, here we go, here's the Bolgegenser, and it was a hit. A lot of people knit it. And it feels so nice to wear, and again, it's not so heavy because it's 2 strands of Drops Eyre together, and it feels really, really nice on your skin. Another alternative for a design in Drops Eyre is the Olea jumper by lovely Rowan of Pages and Projects. So this is actually what I used my sage green drops Eyre in. And this is another example of what I mean. This is knit in staggered fisherman's rib. And I think it shows up really, really nicely in drops Eyre because it's such a subtle yarn. Like when you knit structurally in it, it kind of produces a very light, very, it's a kind of like you have to really look for the design to see it. It's not like in your face, but it is distinctly there. You can see the texture of this. And yeah, I don't think this was the recommended yarn for this sweater. I think she has a little bit of wool sensitivity, so she recommended an acrylic yarn, but I went with drops Eyre, and I absolutely love how it turned out. You can also use drops Eyre for other garments, not just sweaters. I designed my Saleya Vest in drops Eyre, and it actually works really nicely for spring and summer. I wore this in Nice in May, which, if you don't know, it's about 26 to 30 degrees Celsius around that time, which in Fahrenheit, I guess, would be mid 70s to like 80 degrees out. And I mean, this was fine to wear because it's so kind of breathable and lightweight. And in that, how many times can you say breathable and lightweight? But I feel like those are the best descriptors when it comes to this yarn. It is warm, but it's also, I mean, if you're going to wear it over like a summer dress or something, it's not going to overwhelm you. It's not going to be like, oh my gosh, I'm just wearing pure wool, because alpaca is such a nice airy fiber. So here's the Saleya Vest. And I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about how drops Eyre actually feels when you're knitting it. And to do that, I have a work in progress with me. So this is another version of the Saleya Vest that I am making for my mom. And because obviously there are a lot of knitters out there who, I mean, obviously enjoy the finished garment and wearing it, but also are really concerned with the experience of knitting up a certain type of yarn. Drops Eyre, I think the nice thing, because it isn't a blow yarn, is that it's not very splitty. So you don't have to worry about, like, I know there are some yarns with like the two distinct threads that are twisted together, and you have the risk of splitting those threads when you knit the stitches. But drops Eyre doesn't do that because it is very, like, it's very solidly one thread. You can't really split it unless you're trying on purpose. I do recommend, just because I like the stitches to feel a bit slippery, and I think drops Eyre, because of all the little fibers around it, it produces some friction on wooden needles, so I prefer to use metal needles when I'm knitting with drops Eyre. And yeah, I think that's such a nice feeling, is just using drops Eyre on metal needles, and then there you go. There is the right amount of glide for your stitches, and everything knits up pretty quickly, which is why I like to choose drops Eyre. That and the affordability and the comfort is why I choose drops Eyre for a lot of my designs. But yeah, really nice to knit up. And this is almost done, actually. This is in the shade Coral Reef. I'll link to everything that I showed you in the description below, so you can check out anything if you're interested. And as far as how it wears, let me go back to my Olea jumper, because I think I can show you best on that one, and probably also on my Eyre Pullover. Drops Eyre does pill a little bit. I don't know if you can catch that under the arm. There's a little bit of pilling going on. So you do run the risk of pills, but because drops Eyre doesn't really have any mohair in it, you can just de-pill with your shaver of choice. I've actually noticed that too on the Eyre Pullover just a little bit. Can you catch that? Yeah, there's some pilling over here. It's nothing major. It's nothing that, like, I don't think if someone stood where the camera is, I don't think they could see the pilling on me. But like if I point it out, you know, just like, oh, look at these, then you could see it. But again, you could go over it with a shaver really easily, and that would take care of it. I don't think there's any massive pilling that occurs with drops Eyre. As far as I am aware, I've had garments that have been in pretty regular rotation for about a year, and I haven't noticed anything serious with regards to how the yarn wears. I do have a solution though if you really do hate pilling. Like with my Tuscan sweater, which unfortunately I don't have here to show you, I held a strand of Drops Eyre with a strand of mohair, kid silk mohair from Drops, and it doesn't pill at all. I think adding in that additional strand of mohair just for stability and structure really helps avoid pilling. So if you're someone who's like, I do not want to depill my sweaters, I just don't want them to pill, period, then I would recommend knitting Drops Eyre with a strand of mohair, and you would remove that problem altogether and you don't have to deal with pilling. So it wears really well. It is still extremely soft. I usually when I wash Drops Eyre, because I know a lot of people are kind of like, how do I wash this particular yarn? What I like to do is I like to just put it in a bucket of 30 degrees Celsius water. I measure with a little meat thermometer, and then I add in just like a little dollop of natural lanolin, no, not natural lanolin, of Eucalan wool wash that has lanolin in it. I just leave it there to soak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then because Eucalan is no rinse, you just take it right out of the bucket, and I dry it off in a towel. Like I lay it flat on a towel and I roll it out to get all the excess water out of there, and then I just lay it flat to dry. And it's usually Drops Eyre takes about, double-stranded Drops Eyre takes longer to dry, but single-stranded Drops Eyre is usually dry overnight because I just leave it in the heated bathroom, so it's dries really nice and quick. And that seems to be a fairly good way to take care of drop sweaters, I think. And then the lanolin in the Eucalan also helps make the fibers in the sweater a little bit stronger, because that's what lanolin is good for. So yes, that is what I had to tell you about Drops Eyre. I am curious to know if you've ever worked with it. I know it's a fairly common yarn, but I do always run into people who have never touched it before, and I'm really interested to know what your experiences with it have been. Have you noticed any differences between the old manufactured Drops Eyre from Peru and the new one from the EU? I would be curious to know as well, because I haven't, but I don't know, maybe I'm just so enamored that I didn't notice. Are there yarn substitutes for Drops Eyre that you've used before? I'm actually looking for some at the moment. I have considered Kos by Sandnes Garn that I want to try out, and I've also been looking into I know Pickles is another, they're an Oslo brand yarn, but they have something called Pickles Cozy, which I've been interested in trying out. Yeah, so just let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I would love to chat with you about some yarn. And if you want to come over and chat somewhere else, I am over on Instagram and Ravelry and TikTok as The Strickachick, and you can also find me on my own website, thestrickachick.com. Until next time, you guys, happy knitting! Bye!